My name is Clara, and for 27 years, I was the ghost at my own family's table. I was the silent fixer, the invisible support system, the daughter whose achievements were whispered while my brothers were shouted from the rooftops. This Thanksgiving, that was all supposed to change. My parents were hosting the man I had been secretly working with for a year, the legendary tech CEO Julian Croft, a man whose respect I had earned through sheer grit and talent. But as the turkey grew cold and the wine flowed, my father looked across the table, his eyes filled with a familiar mix of pity and disappointment, and declared me useless. He said it in front of everyone, my perfect brother, my social climbing mother, and the one man on earth who knew my actual worth. What my father didn't know, as the word hung in the air like a death sentence, was that Julian Croft wasn't just a guest. He was my business partner, and he was about to make an announcement that would not just save my dignity, but shatter their entire world. If you've ever felt profoundly misunderstood by the people who are supposed to know you best, I need you to do me a favor. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because you are not alone. Before we dive into the most terrifying and validating dinner of my life, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You're going to want to see how this story ends. To truly understand the explosion that happened over the pumpkin pie, you need to understand the invisible architecture of my family. For as long as I can remember, the Henderson household operated on a simple, unspoken principle. My older brother, Ethan, was the product we advertised, and I was the behind-the-scenes labor that made the product shine. Ethan was a stockbroker. He wore sharp suits, drove a leased BMW, and spoke with a confident, booming voice about market trends and quarterly earnings. He was my parents' masterpiece. I, on the other hand, was a researcher and a writer. I didn't have a fancy office or a shiny car. I worked from a small, cluttered desk in the corner of my modest apartment, weaving words and ideas for other people. My name wasn't on the books I ghostwrote or the keynote speeches I crafted for executives. My success was, by its very nature, invisible, and therefore, in my parents' eyes, it was imaginary. My father, David, was a retired sales executive who measured a person's worth by their title and their tax bracket. My mother, Margaret, was a woman who lived for appearances, curating our family's image with the precision of a museum director. In their museum, Ethan was the prized exhibit, and I was the quiet, dutiful docent who made sure the lighting was perfect. This dynamic wasn't just about our careers. It permeated every aspect of our lives. I was the family's emotional ghostwriter. I was the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, buying the gifts that my parents would sign their names to. I was the one who planned every holiday gathering, from the menu to the seating charts, only to have my mother take credit for her effortless hosting skills. I was the one Ethan called in a panic when he'd forgotten to prepare a presentation for work, and I'd stay up all night researching and writing his speaking notes, for which he'd later be praised for his natural brilliance. My contributions were the emotional and logistical equivalent of paying the electricity bill essential for keeping the lights on, but never acknowledged, and certainly never celebrated. The most painful example happened 2 years ago. Ethan decided he wanted to launch a side hustle, a vague and ill-conceived financial consulting business. He needed a sophisticated website and a full suite of marketing materials. My parents, eager to fund their golden boy's next venture, offered to pay a professional firm over $10,000. I stepped in, horrified by the waste. "Let me do it," I pleaded. "I can build a better website for a fraction of the cost." For 2 solid months, I poured every spare moment into his project. I designed a sleek, professional logo, wrote compelling copy, and built a website that looked like it belonged to a Fortune 500 company. I did it all for the cost of the software I had to buy. When it was finished, my dad looked at it, genuinely impressed. "Wow, Clara," he said. "This is really professional. I didn't know you had it in you." The next week, at a family dinner, he proudly showed the website to my uncle, boasting, "Look what Ethan put together. The kid's a natural entrepreneur. Built it all himself. Ethan just smiled and accepted the praise. I sat there, a ghost at the table, my own work being used as proof of my brother's genius. I didn't say a word. I had learned long ago that my role was to be the silent architect of their success, never the resident of the beautiful house I had built. So when my mother called me in early October, her voice giddy with excitement about Thanksgiving, a familiar sense of dread washed over me. "Clara, you will not believe who your father managed to invite for dinner this year," she'd gushed. "The Julian Croft!" The name hit me like a jolt of electricity. Julian Croft wasn't just a CEO. He was a legend, a reclusive tech visionary who had changed the world with his software. And for the past 12 months, he had also been my secret. He was the subject of the biography I had been painstakingly, anonymously ghostwriting. He was the one man outside of my family who knew the true scope of my talent. "We have to be on our absolute best behavior," my mother continued, oblivious to the bomb she had just dropped. "This is a huge opportunity for Ethan to network. Julian is a major investor. This could be the big break we've been waiting for." I leaned my head against the cold glass of my apartment window, a bitter laugh bubbling in my throat. They were polishing their prized exhibit, getting him ready for the big show. They had no idea the quiet, useless ghost they'd ignored for years was about to become the most powerful person in the room. The 6 weeks leading up to Thanksgiving felt like living a double life on an entirely new level. By day, I was Clara Henderson, the disappointing daughter, receiving a barrage of texts and calls from my mother about the Thanksgiving menu, the proper way to set a table for a billionaire, and gentle but firm suggestions that I should buy a more professional outfit for the occasion. My contributions were, as always, logistical. I was tasked with creating the place cards, using my hobby skills, picking up the specialty wine my dad insisted on, and preparing my signature cranberry orange relish, the one dish my mother always passed off as her own secret recipe. The entire event was being framed as Ethan's big chance. My father would call me with updates that were really just thinly veiled instructions. "Clara, I was thinking Ethan should sit next to Mr. Croft at the table to facilitate conversation. You can sit at the end, next to your Aunt Patty. Make sure you keep her glass full." I was being positioned quite literally, on the sidelines of my own secret life. But by night, after my family thought I was probably just tinkering on my computer, I was on secure video calls with the Julian Croft. Our relationship had evolved far beyond a simple author-ghostwriter dynamic. It had become a true intellectual partnership. Julian was a brilliant but disorganized visionary. His mind was a whirlwind of groundbreaking ideas, personal anecdotes, and profound insights, but he struggled to corral them into a linear narrative. That's where I came in. I wasn't just a writer. I was an architect. I listened for hours as he spoke, identifying the core themes, drawing connections he hadn't seen, and structuring the chaotic brilliance of his life into a compelling, powerful story. I challenged his assumptions, debated his conclusions, and unearthed memories he had long since buried. Our calls were intense, exhilarating, and deeply respectful. He never treated me like a subordinate. He called me his thought partner. "Clara," he'd said to me one night, after I had helped him articulate a particularly difficult chapter about the early struggles of his company, "you have a gift not just for writing, but for listening. You hear the music behind the words. This book wouldn't exist without you. It would just be a pile of notes." Coming from a man who rarely gave compliments, his words were like a lifeline. They were a confirmation of the value I knew I had, a value that was completely invisible within the walls of my own family's home. He had no idea, of course, that the family I occasionally mentioned in passing was the very one he was about to meet. When my father, through a distant business acquaintance, had managed to land Julian for Thanksgiving, it was a fluke of cosmic irony. Julian, who rarely accepted social invitations, had agreed because he was in town visiting a new research facility and, as he later told me, he was tired of spending the holiday alone in a hotel. My assistant said it's a family named Henderson. He'd mentioned casually on a call. Do you know them? I remember the pause, the way my heart hammered against my ribs. I could have told him then, but some part of me, some bruised and foolish part, wanted to see what would happen. I wanted, for once, to let the two halves of my life collide without my careful management. The name sounds familiar, I'd said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. It's a small world. As Thanksgiving drew nearer, my family's performance intensified. Ethan was studying up on Julian's company, which meant I was the one secretly emailing him talking points and summaries of Julian's recent interviews. Just want to be prepared, Ethan had said, oblivious to the fact that I was the world's foremost expert on the subject. My dad bought a new set of crystal whiskey glasses for the occasion. My mom scheduled a professional cleaning service for the day before, even though I was the one who cleaned the house every week. They were setting a stage for a play, and they had already cast me in the role of a background extra. The weekend before the big day, I met with Julian in person at his hotel to go over the final manuscript. The book was done. It was a masterpiece, a powerful and intimate look at a man who had reshaped the digital world. He closed the final page, a rare, genuine smile on his face. "Clara," he said, "this is more than I ever could have hoped for. We made a hell of a team." He then told me he had a proposition to discuss with me after the holiday. Something beyond the book. My mind raced with possibilities, but I pushed them aside, focusing on the impending storm. The secret I was keeping felt heavy and dangerous. It was a ticking time bomb, placed right in the center of my mother's perfectly set Thanksgiving table, and I had no idea if the explosion would liberate me or destroy me completely. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with the kind of crisp, cinematic autumn light that feels full of promise. In the Henderson house, however, it was full of panic. My mother, Margaret, was in a state of controlled hysteria, orchestrating the day's events like a frantic conductor. The entire house had been scrubbed, polished, and decorated to within an inch of its life. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a showroom. A carefully staged environment designed to communicate one thing: success. My brother Ethan was the living embodiment of this stagecraft. He emerged from his room around 10 a.m., already dressed in a tailored blazer, a crisp button-down shirt, and pants so sharply creased they looked like they could cut glass. He smelled of expensive cologne and ambition. "Morning," he said, breezing past me in the kitchen without making eye contact. I was, at that moment, wrestling with a 20-pound turkey, my hands covered in butter and herbs. I had been up since 6 a.m., handling the real, unglamorous work that a perfect Thanksgiving requires. "Ethan, can you at least peel the potatoes?" My mom called from the dining room, where she was adjusting the centerpiece for the 10th time. "Can't, Mom," he shot back. "I need to review my notes on Croft's Q3 earnings report. Gotta be sharp." The notes, of course, were the ones I had written for him. I said nothing, just turned my attention back to the turkey. My resentment was a low, steady hum beneath the surface of the day's forced festivity. Julian Croft was scheduled to arrive at 2 p.m. My father, David, spent the morning pacing the living room, checking his watch every 5 minutes. He had selected a specific bottle of 19-year-old single malt scotch, which he placed in a prominent position on the bar cart. "This is what men like Croft drink," he announced to no one in particular. "It shows taste." The entire day was a performance, and they were all method actors. At precisely 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. My mother smoothed her dress. My father straightened his tie, and Ethan struck a casual but confident pose by the fireplace. "Clara, get the door!" my mother hissed from the living room. I quickly wiped my hands on my apron, took a deep breath, and walked to the foyer. As I opened the door, my two worlds collided with the force of a silent thunderclap. There he was, Julian Croft. In person, he was even more imposing than on a video call. He was tall and lean, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was dressed in a simple, elegant cashmere sweater and dark jeans, an outfit that screamed quiet confidence, a stark contrast to my brother's try-hard blazer. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, a flicker of surprise and recognition crossed his face before he expertly masked it. "You must be Clara," he said, his voice a low, warm baritone. He extended a hand, and as I took it, a small, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. He knew. My family, hearing his voice, descended upon the foyer like a flock of perfectly coiffed vultures. "Julian, welcome!" my father boomed, clapping him on the shoulder. "So glad you could make it." "I'm David Henderson." "Margaret," my mother said, offering a perfectly manicured hand. "It is an absolute honor to have you in our home." Then Ethan stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Ethan Henderson," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Huge admirer of your work, sir. Your disruption of the cloud computing space was nothing short of genius." Julian shook his hand, his expression polite but unreadable. His eyes, however, briefly flickered back to me, a silent question hanging in the air. I just gave a tiny, almost invisible shake of my head. "Not yet." "And you've met our daughter, Clara," my mother said, gesturing vaguely in my direction as if I were a piece of furniture. "She's our creative one." The label, meant to be a compliment, was delivered with a tone of fond condescension. It was code for the one without a real job. "Yes, we've met," Julian said smoothly, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. "Clara, it's a pleasure to see you again." The again was a small grenade, but my family was too busy ushering their prize into the living room to notice. "Clara, honey, could you get Mr. Croft a drink?" my mother called over her shoulder. "And bring out the appetizers you made." And just like that, I was relegated back to my role as the invisible hostess. Over the next hour, I became a blur of motion, refilling glasses, passing around canapes, and clearing away empty plates, all while my family put on their masterclass performance. They had Ethan positioned next to Julian on the couch, where he launched into a self-important monologue about the stock market, peppering his speech with the buzzwords I had fed him. My father chimed in with anecdotes about his own glory days in sales, attempting to establish himself as a peer. My mother steered the conversation towards their recent trip to Europe, a trip I had helped pay for with the advance from Julian's book. I watched from the doorway of the kitchen, a ghost observing her own haunting. Julian was a masterful guest, polite and engaging, but I could see the subtle signs of his perception. I saw the way his eyes would glaze over slightly when Ethan started talking about synergy. I saw the way he noticed I was the only one clearing glasses. And I saw the way his gaze would occasionally find mine across the room. A silent, steady acknowledgement that he was the only other person there who knew the truth. The performance was in full swing, but the audience was not as captivated as the actors believed. The hour between the appetizers and the call to dinner was the most excruciating part of the day. It was a masterclass in the subtle art of familial diminishment, performed for an audience of one. With Julian Croft as the captive spectator, my family seemed determined to solidify my status as the resident failure, perhaps as a way to make Ethan's manufactured success seem even brighter in contrast. It began with my father. After Ethan had finally exhausted his repertoire of market analysis buzzwords, my dad turned his attention to me as I was quietly refilling a bowl of spiced nuts. "So, Clara," he began, his voice taking on the booming, faux casual tone he used when he was about to make a point. "Julian here is a man who built an empire from the ground up. He knows what it takes. Why don't you tell him what you've been working on lately?" It wasn't a genuine question. It was a trap, a public invitation for me to describe my hobby in front of a man of real substance. I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. "Oh, just various writing and research projects," I said vaguely, hoping to deflect. But my father was relentless. "Various projects? Come on, you can be more specific than that. Are you getting paid for these projects? Or is it more of a passion thing?" The implication was clear. If it wasn't generating a six-figure salary, it wasn't real work. Julian, sensing my discomfort, smoothly interjected. Actually, David, the world of freelance research and strategic writing is incredibly demanding. The ability to synthesize complex information and communicate it clearly is a rare and valuable skill. My father looked momentarily taken aback, but recovered quickly. Oh, of course. Valuable, yes. But as a parent, you worry. You want to see your kids on a clear path. A career. Not just floating. It was my mother's turn next. She glided over, a fresh glass of wine in her hand, and patted my shoulder with a gesture that was meant to look affectionate but felt deeply condescending. What your father means, Julian, she said, addressing him directly, as if I weren't even there, is that we are so proud of Ethan for building a traditional career. He has a 401k, a clear upward trajectory. It gives a parent peace of mind. With Clara, well, she's always been our little free spirit. We just hope she finds her footing soon. It's not easy for a young woman to be so untethered. Untethered. The word hung in the air, painting me as a directionless wanderer, a flighty artist with no grasp on reality. In truth, I had more savings than Ethan did, I knew, because I had helped him set up a budget last year when he'd overspent on a trip to Vegas. I had a detailed 5-year plan for my business, but my reality didn't fit their narrative. Ethan, emboldened by their lead, decided to chime in with a joke. "Don't worry, Mom," he said with a loud, hearty laugh. "If her writing thing doesn't work out, she can always be my personal assistant. I could use someone to organize my schedule." He winked at me, as if we were in on the joke together. But it wasn't a joke. It was a public assertion of his superiority, a casual dismissal of my entire professional identity. The room filled with polite, uncomfortable laughter. My father chuckled. My mother smiled weakly. Even my Aunt Patty, who usually stayed out of it, let out a little titter. I just stood there, the bowl of nuts in my hand, suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I felt Julian's eyes on me, his expression a careful, unreadable mask, but I saw something in the tightening of his jaw, a flicker of something. It looked like anger. For a moment, I thought he might say something, might defend me, but he remained silent, just watching, observing, gathering data like the brilliant analyst he was. The interrogation continued. They asked me if I had a boyfriend, if I was dating, if I planned on settling down anytime soon. Each question was a paper cut, a small, sharp reminder of all the ways I was failing to meet their conventional standards of success. I answered with quiet, one-word answers, my spirit slowly eroding with each new line of questioning. They were systematically dismantling me in front of the one person whose professional respect I valued more than anything. They were trying to define me for him, to paint a picture of a lovable but lost little girl who didn't have her life together. The tragic irony, of course, was that they were showcasing their own profound ignorance. They were trying to sell a story to the man who had already read the entire book. And the final, devastating chapter was about to begin. The transition from the living room to the dining room was a brief reprieve, a moment of orchestrated chaos that allowed me to escape the relentless barrage of their judgment. As I was putting the final touches on the turkey platter in the kitchen, I overheard my parents' voices, low and urgent, coming from the adjoining pantry. The door was slightly ajar, and I froze, my hand hovering over the parsley. I knew I shouldn't listen, but I was a raw, open wound, and their words were the salt I couldn't seem to avoid. "Did you see the way he looks at Ethan?" my mother whispered, her voice tight with a nervous energy. "He seems impressed. I think this is going really well." There was a heavy sigh from my father. "It has to, Margaret. It just has to." His voice was different. The usual booming confidence was gone, replaced by a thin, brittle weariness that I had never heard before. "The market has been a bloodbath. My portfolio is down nearly 40% this year. And Ethan, he called me last night. That big client he was banking on pulled out. He's in serious trouble, Carol." He's leveraged up to his eyeballs. My mother gasped. What? He told me the deal was a sure thing. He said he was about to get a huge commission. He was projecting, my dad said, his voice laced with a bitterness that was clearly directed at himself. He was telling us what we wanted to hear. The truth is, that consulting business of his is a money pit, and he's been covering his losses with credit. He's drowning. I leaned against the counter, the weight of the turkey platter forgotten. It felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath me. All of it, the blazer, the confident talk of market disruption, the casual bragging, it was all a lie. A desperate, elaborate performance designed to hide the fact that their golden boy was a spectacular failure. And I suddenly understood. Their relentless need to prop up Ethan, and to diminish me in the process, wasn't just about favoritism. It was about survival. So this dinner, my mother began, her voice trembling. This isn't just about networking. This is about a bailout. This is about a Hail Mary. My father corrected her grimly. If Ethan can impress Croft, if he can get a job, an investment, anything, it might be the only thing that saves him from total financial ruin. And us along with him. I co-signed his business loan, Margaret. If he defaults, we could lose the house. Lose the house. The words hung in the small, dark space of the pantry, and I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. The house I had grown up in, the house I had silently helped maintain with my own invisible income, was on the line. Everything suddenly clicked into place with a horrifying, crystalline clarity. Their fawning over Julian, their relentless promotion of Ethan, their casual cruelty towards me, it was all part of a desperate, high-stakes gamble. They had to present a flawless portrait of success to this powerful man, and in that portrait, there was no room for a daughter who was a freelancer, an artist, a question mark. I wasn't just an afterthought. I was a potential liability to their plan. My unconventional, unsettled life was a crack in the perfect facade they were trying to sell. They weren't just ignoring my success. They were actively suppressing it because it didn't fit the narrative they needed Julian to believe. I felt a surge of something hot and furious in my chest. It was a rage so pure and so potent, it almost made me dizzy. They were sacrificing me, my dignity, and my spirit on the altar of my brother's failure. All to save themselves from the consequences of their own bad investments, both financial and emotional. I pushed away from the counter, my hands shaking. I picked up the heavy platter, my movements stiff and robotic. I walked out of the kitchen and into the dining room, where everyone was taking their seats. I saw my brother, Ethan, pulling out a chair for Julian, a practiced, charming smile on his face. He looked like a king holding court, completely unaware that his kingdom was crumbling, that his crown was made of cardboard, and that his entire future rested on this one, single, desperate performance. I placed the turkey in the center of the table, the symbolic centerpiece of a holiday that was supposed to be about gratitude but had become about greed and desperation. As I took my seat at the far end of the table, next to the babbling Aunt Patty, I caught Julian's eye. He gave me a small, questioning look, sensing the shift in my demeanor. I gave him nothing back. My face was a placid, unreadable mask. But underneath, a revolution was brewing. They had no idea that the useless daughter they had just written off was the only person in the family who was actually solvent. And I had no idea that my father was about to hand me the very match I needed to burn their whole charade to the ground. The dinner began with a painful, forced cheerfulness. The clinking of silverware and the murmur of polite conversation filled the room. But underneath it all, the tension was a palpable, living thing. I watched my family operate with the desperate precision of a bomb squad. My mother laughed a little too loudly at Julian's jokes. My father kept steering the conversation back to business and finance, creating openings for Ethan to jump in. And Ethan, to his credit, played his part with the skill of a seasoned actor. He talked about emerging markets and disruptive technologies, using the exact phrases and concepts I had outlined for him in my research notes. He was confident, articulate, and completely fraudulent. I felt a strange, out-of-body detachment, as if I were watching a play for which I had written all the lines. I picked at my food, the delicious meal I had spent all morning preparing tasting like ash in my mouth. I could feel Julian's occasional glances in my direction, but I kept my eyes fixed on my plate, counting the seconds until this ordeal was over. The breaking point came, as it so often does in my family, under the guise of a celebration. My father stood up, tapping his wineglass with a knife. The room fell silent. "I'd like to propose a toast," he began, his face flushed with wine and a desperate manufactured pride. He raised his glass. "First, to our esteemed guest, Julian Croft. It is an honor to have a man of your caliber at our table. A true visionary." Julian gave a polite, almost imperceptible nod. "And second," my father continued, turning his beaming gaze upon my brother, "I want to toast my son, Ethan. A man who embodies the spirit of ambition and success that this country was built on. He's a shark in a world of minnows, and his mother and I could not be prouder of the career and the life he is building." "To Ethan! To Ethan!" my mother echoed, her eyes shining with tears that were probably genuine. They had poured all of their hopes, all of their self-worth, into him. His success was their success. His failure, a concept they refused to entertain, would be their ruin. Then, my father's gaze swung down the long, polished length of the dining table and landed on me. His smile faltered for a moment, the practiced warmth replaced by a flicker of something else, pity, frustration, disappointment. It was the look he always gave me when he was confronted with the reality of my unconventional life. "And to Clara," he said, his voice dropping a full octave, the celebratory tone vanishing completely. "She's still finding her way, our artistic one, but she has a good heart, and we know she'll figure things out eventually. We love her anyway. We love her anyway." The two words were a punch to the gut. It was love with a condition, an asterisk. Love in spite of my perceived failures. The entire table was quiet, the air thick with embarrassment. I could feel my cheeks burning, a hot, shameful flush. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. But it wasn't over. Ethan, emboldened by the wine and his own successful performance, decided to add a final, crushing blow. He let out a condescending chuckle. "Don't worry, Dad," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "She'll be fine. Every family needs a professional dreamer, right?" Then, he looked directly at Julian, as if letting him in on a private family joke. "Honestly, Julian, it's a constant worry. My parents poured so much into her education, all that potential, and she's just, well, it feels useless, you know? All that talent, and she just dabbles. It's a shame. Useless." He said it. The word they had all been thinking, the subtext of 1,000 conversations, was finally spoken aloud. It landed in the center of the table with a sickening thud. Useless. My work, my passion, my entire identity, reduced to a single damning adjective. I looked at my parents. My mother was studiously examining her wineglass. My father had a tight, uncomfortable smile on his face. They didn't defend me. They didn't correct him. Their silence was a confirmation. They agreed. I felt something inside me snap. A cord that had been stretched taut for 27 years finally broke. The ghost in the machine suddenly came to life. I was done being silent. I was done being a ghost. I opened my mouth to speak, to unleash a torrent of truth that would have burned their perfectly curated world to the ground. I was going to tell them about Ethan's debt, about their own financial desperation, about the book, about everything. But before I could utter a single word, another voice cut through the silence. A voice that was calm, measured, and held the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "Useless?" Julian Croft said, placing his fork and knife down on his plate with a quiet, deliberate click. He slowly dabbed his mouth with his napkin, his eyes, sharp and cold as ice, fixed on my brother. That's a fascinating choice of words, Ethan. The entire table froze, all eyes snapping to him. The air crackled with a new, terrifying energy. The guest of honor was about to speak, and I had a feeling the performance was finally over. The silence that followed Julian's question was unlike any I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. My family, who had been so effortlessly confident just moments before, now looked like a group of startled animals caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. Ethan's smug smile had vanished, replaced by a look of baffled confusion. My father's face was a mask of alarm, his grand toast having just horribly backfired. My mother looked like she might faint. They had lost control of the narrative, and the power in the room had just shifted, decisively and irrevocably. Julian took a slow, deliberate sip of water, his gaze never leaving my brother. "You see," he continued, his voice conversationally calm, which only made it more menacing. "I've spent the last year of my life searching for a very specific set of skills. I needed someone who could not only write with elegance and precision, but who could also think with immense strategic depth. Someone who could take a lifetime of chaotic data interviews, transcripts, financial reports, personal journals, and architect it into a cohesive, powerful narrative. I needed a partner who was part writer, part historian, part business analyst, and part psychologist." He paused, letting his words sink in. He then turned his head slightly, and his piercing gaze moved from my brother, to my father, to my mother, and finally, it rested on me. The look in his eyes was no longer unreadable. It was filled with a profound and unwavering respect. "I needed someone who wasn't just a dreamer, Ethan," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "I needed a builder. And for the past year, the person who has been my silent partner in building the most important project of my life, my memoir, has been your sister." The collective gasp from my family was audible. It was a sharp, ragged intake of breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. My father's face went from red to a ghostly white. My mother's hand flew to her pearls, clutching them as if they were a life raft. Ethan looked as if he had been physically struck, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. They were all staring at me, their eyes wide with a dawning horror and disbelief. They were looking at me, truly looking at me, for the first time all day. You wrote his book?" My mother stammered, her voice a strangled whisper. "The Julian Crofts book?" "Clara did more than write it." Julian corrected her gently, but with an edge of steel. "She was the architect. She found the story, she shaped the vision, and she challenged me to be more honest and insightful than I thought possible. The book that is currently set to be the lead title for Simon & Schuster next fall, the book for which I have already received a 7-figure advance, is as much her creation as it is mine. 7 figures." The words detonated in the silence of the room. I saw my father do a quick, instinctive calculation in his head, his eyes widening in shock. The useless daughter, the one with the hobby, had just been linked to a sum of money that dwarfed anything Ethan had ever touched, even in his most fabricated stories. But Julian wasn't finished. This wasn't just about defending my honor. It was about an unveiling. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sleek, leather-bound document. He placed it on the table with a soft, definitive thud. "Which brings me to my next project," he said, his voice now crisp and businesslike. "For the past few months, I've been planning the launch of a new venture, a media and consulting firm that will focus on helping leaders and innovators tell their stories, both in print and on the global stage. It requires a very specific kind of leadership, someone with unimpeachable integrity, a brilliant strategic mind, and a deep understanding of narrative. I've been searching for a founding partner." He let the suspense build, his eyes scanning the frozen faces around the table. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I knew, with a dizzying certainty, what was coming next. So, David, Margaret, Julian said, his voice now holding a note of undisguised triumph. I find your assessment of your daughter's utility to be profoundly misinformed. So much so that I have flown here today not just to enjoy a Thanksgiving meal, but to formally offer her the position. Actually, more than a position, a partnership. He slid the leather-bound document across the polished surface of the table. It stopped directly in front of my plate. Clara, he said, and for the first time he smiled. A wide, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. I would be honored if you would accept my offer to become the co-founder and chief creative officer of Croft Henderson Media. The room was absolutely, deathly silent. My family stared at the document, then at me, then back at the document. The ghost they had ignored for a lifetime had just been revealed as a queen, and the man they had spent all day trying to impress had just offered her half of his new kingdom. And all they could do was watch, frozen in their chairs, as I reached out a steady hand and pulled my future towards me. The moments that followed Julian's announcement were a slow-motion study in human collapse. The carefully constructed glass house of my family's pride and illusion didn't just crack. It shattered into a million invisible pieces, and the sound it made was a profound, deafening silence. My father, David, was the first to break. He stared at the partnership agreement lying in front of me as if it were a venomous snake. The blood had drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale sheen. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the gears of his pragmatic, numbers-oriented mind grinding to a halt. Utterly incapable of processing this new, world-altering data. The daughter he had pitied, the one he had just publicly devalued, was being handed an opportunity that he, in his entire 60-year life, could only have dreamed of. His entire system of measuring worth had just been obliterated. My mother, Margaret, reacted next. Her social instincts, honed over a lifetime of prioritizing appearances, kicked into a desperate, frantic overdrive. She let out a laugh, a sound so brittle and high-pitched it was painful to hear. "Well, isn't that just wonderful?" she exclaimed, her eyes darting between me and Julian, a frantic, pleading smile plastered on her face. "Clara! Honey! Why didn't you tell us? You've been holding out on us. Oh, we are just bursting with pride." The performance was so transparent, so nakedly opportunistic, that it was almost pitiful. She was trying to rewrite history in real time, to absorb my success into the family narrative as if they had been championing it all along. She was trying to glue the shattered glass back together before anyone noticed the cracks. But the most telling reaction came from my brother. Ethan's face had gone through a rapid, terrifying series of transformations. First, shock. Then, disbelief. Then, a dark, ugly flush of crimson that started at his neck and crept up to his hairline. It was the color of pure, undiluted rage. The Golden Boy, the prized exhibit, had just been upstaged in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had been exposed as a fraud in front of his idol, and the person who had exposed him was the sister he had just dismissed as useless. He pushed his chair back violently, the legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "This is a joke, right?" he spat, his eyes wild. "This is some kind of sick joke. You've been working for him? Behind our backs? What did you do, Clara? Manipulate him?" Julian's calm demeanor finally cracked. His eyes narrowed, and a cold, dangerous fury entered his voice. "I would choose your next words very carefully, Ethan," he said, his tone low and lethal. "Your sister earned her position through a level of talent and hard work that, forgive me for being blunt, you don't seem to comprehend. She didn't manipulate anyone. She delivered. And as for working behind your backs, it seems to me that a person's professional life is their own, especially when their family shows absolutely no interest in it." That was it. The final, devastating confirmation. The dam of my composure finally broke, but not in the way I expected. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I started to laugh. It started as a low chuckle, a bubble of incredulous, hysterical laughter that I couldn't contain. I laughed at the absurdity of it all. I laughed at the shocked, horrified faces of my family. I laughed at the years of silent frustration, the decades of being overlooked, all culminating in this single, perfect, karmic moment of vindication. My laughter, clear and unrestrained, was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of a ghost finally finding her voice. I pushed back my chair and stood up, the laughter subsiding into a calm, steady smile. I picked up the leather-bound partnership agreement. "Julian," I said, turning to him, and ignoring the stunned statues that were my family, "I would be honored to accept your offer." I then turned my gaze back to my parents and my brother. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice even and clear. "It's been illuminating, but we have an early flight to New York tomorrow to meet with the publisher. So, if you'll excuse us, my partner and I have to leave." The word partner hung in the air, a final, beautiful assertion of my new reality. Julian stood up, placing his napkin neatly on the table. He gave my speechless father a curt nod. "David, Margaret," he said, his voice dripping with a cool, polite finality. "Thank you for the meal. You have an extraordinary daughter. I suggest you start treating her like one." And with that, we turned and walked away. We didn't run. We walked, with a calm, deliberate pace, out of the dining room, through the foyer, and out the front door into the crisp, cold November night. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the ruins of their Thanksgiving dinner behind me. The silence, the shock, the dawning, catastrophic realization that the ghost they had spent a lifetime ignoring was the one who had just inherited the world. The moment the front door clicked shut behind us, it felt like I could breathe again. The cool night air was a balm on my superheated emotions. Julian's driver was waiting at the curb in a sleek black sedan, the engine humming quietly. He opened the door for us, and as I slid into the plush leather seat, I felt like I was crossing a threshold into a new dimension. The car pulled away from the curb, and I watched my childhood home, the meticulously curated stage for my family's lifelong performance, shrink in the rearview mirror until it was just another anonymous house on a quiet, suburban street. I expected to feel a wave of sadness, of loss. Instead, all I felt was a profound, exhilarating sense of freedom. I had not been banished. I had escaped. Julian was quiet for the first few minutes of the drive, giving me space. "Are you all right?" he finally asked, his voice gentle. "I'm better than all right," I replied, and I was surprised to find that it was the absolute truth. "I feel born." He smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "Good," he said, "because our flight to New York is at 7 a.m. We have a breakfast meeting with the head of Simon & Schuster at 10. Welcome to your new life, partner." The next 6 months were a blur of exhilarating, relentless work. We launched Croft Henderson Media from a temporary office in a Manhattan high-rise, working 17-hour days, fueled by coffee and a shared, obsessive vision. It was the hardest I had ever worked in my life, and the happiest I had ever been. I was no longer a ghostwriter. I was a founder. My opinions weren't just heard. They were sought after. My vision wasn't just tolerated. It was integral to the company's DNA. We hired a small, brilliant team, and I discovered I had a talent not just for creating, but for leading. I found a beautiful apartment in Brooklyn with a view of the Manhattan skyline, a view that reminded me every day of how far I had come. I filled it with books, art, and friends. My new life was rich with the kind of intellectual and emotional nourishment I had been starved of for so long. The book, when it was released in the spring, was a phenomenon. The Architect of Tomorrow, with both of our names on the cover in bold, equal type, debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for weeks. My invisible work was suddenly very, very visible. I did television interviews, spoke at conferences, and saw my name in print in magazines I had once only dreamed of reading. My family, back in their quiet, shattered suburb, could not have missed it. They tried, of course, to reconnect. The calls started about a month after I left. They were clumsy, pathetic attempts to rewrite the past. My mother would call and talk about how she always knew I had this in me. My father would leave voicemails talking about how proud he was, his voice thick with a regret that sounded more like self-pity. I kept the conversations short and polite, but I erected a firm, impenetrable boundary. The old dynamic was dead, and I refused to let it be resurrected. The most shocking call came from Ethan. He called me late one night, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. His consulting business had officially collapsed. He was in massive debt, and the leased BMW was gone. "I don't get it, Clara," he'd said, his voice hollow. "I did everything right. I played the game. You broke all the rules, and you won. How?" "I didn't play the game, Ethan," I told him, my voice not unkind, but firm. "I did the work. The family house, the one my father had been so terrified of losing, was put on the market 4 months later. They had to downsize, a public admission of the financial failure they had tried so desperately to hide. It was a painful, humbling consequence of a lifetime of betting on the wrong things. I felt a distant pang of sympathy for them, but it was overshadowed by the fierce, protective love I now felt for the life I had built. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. Their kingdom, built on a foundation of appearances and lies, had crumbled. Mine, built on a foundation of authentic, hard work, was just beginning to rise. It's been a little over a year since that fateful Thanksgiving. The offices of Croft Henderson Media now occupy 2 full floors of a glass-walled skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. The view from my office, where my name is elegantly lettered on the door, is a constant, breathtaking reminder that my life is my own. Our company has become a powerhouse in the world of strategic communications, and our client list includes some of the most innovative and influential leaders on the planet. The work is challenging, meaningful, and deeply fulfilling. The ghost is not only visible now, she's in charge. My relationship with my family has settled into a new, strange, and distant kind of normal. After they sold the house, they moved into a smaller condo an hour away. The downsizing was a public and humbling experience for them, and it seems to have forced a level of introspection they had avoided for their entire lives. We speak on holidays and birthdays. The conversations are polite, strained, and carefully devoid of the old dynamics. They no longer offer unsolicited advice or backhanded compliments. They ask about my work with a sort of timid awe, as if speaking to a foreign dignitary. The power has shifted so completely that they don't know how to relate to me anymore. In a way, I have become a stranger to them, and perhaps that's for the best. We were, it turns out, strangers all along. Ethan is working an entry-level job at a different financial firm, starting over. I hear he's humbled, quieter. I hope, for his sake, that he learns that true value isn't about the title on your business card, but about the substance of your character. Last month, Julian and I were featured in a Forbes magazine article about the fastest-growing media startups of the year. There was a full-page photo of us, standing side by side in our sunlit office. Equals. Partners. My mother framed a copy of it and put it on her new, much smaller mantelpiece. When I saw it during a brief visit, I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a quiet, melancholy sadness for all the years they had refused to see the real picture that was right in front of them. The greatest lesson I learned from this whole experience wasn't about success or money. It was about worth. For so long, I had allowed my value to be determined by a small, biased, and deeply flawed focus group of 3 people. I had been fighting for a seat at a table where the meal was poisoned with conditional love and casual disrespect. The moment I stopped fighting for their approval and started fighting for my own future was the moment my life truly began. The useless label they pinned on me was never about me at all. It was a reflection of their own limited vision, their own fears, their own inability to value what they couldn't easily measure or advertise. It was a cage they tried to put me in, but the door was never locked. I just had to realize I had the strength to walk out. My life now is a testament to the fact that your real family are the people who see your value, even when you're invisible to the rest of the world. It's the mentors who champion you, the friends who cheer for you, and the partners who see you as an equal. My kingdom wasn't handed to me. It was built, word by word, idea by idea, in the quiet, lonely hours when no one was watching. And that makes it all the more beautiful. It makes it all mine. Have you ever had a moment where you had to define your own worth, separate from your family's expectations? I would be truly honored to hear your story in the comments below. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever felt like the ghost at the table, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more true stories about reclaiming your own narrative. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who might need to be reminded that their useless hobby might just be their superpower in disguise. Thank you for listening. May you always remember that you are the author, the architect, and the CEO of your own incredible story.